The Chicago Defender, which was owned by the Abbott and Sengstack family for nearly a century, is the most important African-American newspaper in the United States history. And many people believe that the records of the family and of the paper had been lost. They'd never been open to the public. There'd been a change of ownership at the Defender, and really nobody knew what had happened to what we would view as the archives of that family and its commercial enterprise. And I had known Bobby Sengstack, the son of John Sengstack, the last family publisher of the newspapers, actually since the 1970s. But it was only when I had the assistance and wonderful intervention of Professor Jacqueline Goldsby of the University of Chicago to work along with me in convincing Bobby Sengstack that he would do well to donate the papers to an institution where they could be cared for and made accessible to the public, that he made the decision to keep them here in Chicago and donate them to the Vivian Harsh Research Collection. So that happened in 2007. And I think he did so more out of civic pride than anything else. That is, he wanted to be sure that the family's legacy remained in the city of Chicago. And this was the most appropriate institution to do that. Well, they really were in no order. An archivist's greatest challenge and sometimes worst nightmare. We brought in 83 containers, some of them very large containers, of material that had been in Bobby's loft. And they were, for the most part, in no order at all. And so you had to decide how you would process that. And we began by doing sorts. That is, we would open up each container and take inventory of what was in that container. And this was actually done by the interns of Mapping the Stacks, in this case, Marsha Walker, Celeste Moore, and Tracy Parker. And they inventoried every container. When we looked at the inventory, we were then able to decide what might be appropriate sorts to use. So you sorted things, for example, like correspondence, financial records, records of the newspapers. They own not only the Chicago Defender, but the Tri-State Defender in Memphis, the Pittsburgh Courier in Pittsburgh, all of the Michigan Chronicle in Detroit, all of the different papers the family owned. And you'd sort things by format, like photographs, serial publications, clipping files, files of organizations, all of these different kinds of material. So having been able to sort those into, which in itself was an enormous and lengthy task, into these large groupings, you took each of those on and thought about how you would have an arrangement scheme, a concept that researchers could use in order to find what they needed to find and understand the history of the family and the history of the commercial enterprises in the history of journalism that this family invented and directed. And so that led us to where we are now, this enormous arrangement of 251 containers in 3 different series. When I say 3 different super series, we had to be concerned with the fact that it wasn't one set of papers. It really was 3 sets of papers. The papers of the founder of the Chicago Defender, Robert Abbott, and some of those materials go back to the mid-19th century. The papers of his nephew, John Sengstack, who succeeded Abbott after Abbott died in 1940, and the papers of John Sengstack's wife, Myrtle Sengstack, who had an entirely different family background, came from a New Orleans Creole tradition, even though she was raised in Los Angeles, and married John Sengstack and made her own unique contribution to this group of papers you see here today. There are a couple of stories that really moved me very greatly. One is that we knew a fair amount about the involvement of the Chicago Defender and of John Sengstack in particular in the struggle over race relations in the United States Armed Forces during World War II and in the subsequent desegregation of the armed forces up through 1955. But we didn't know any of the inside dope. We didn't know any of the correspondence, the confidential reports, any of those things that concern race relations and desegregation. And frankly, we have a very different window now to see how this transpired and what the role of the Chicago Defender and the national, what was originally the Negro Newspaper Publishers Association, NMPA, it's now called National Newspaper Publishers Association, was in this struggle over how the United States Armed Forces should be run. During World War II, we were supposed to be fighting this struggle against Nazism, fascism, a virulent racist ideology that was of European origin and was overseas. But at the same time, in the United States, you had a lot of white supremacist notions that were running this country. A country in which the national government tolerated complete segregation of its armed forces. And so we now know the inside story of how John Sengstack, the Chicago Defender, the Negro Newspaper Publishers Association, which he was instrumental in founding, fought a struggle inside the government in order to transform that policy into one which eventually desegregated the armed forces in 1955. There was a whole war effort bureaucracy, and in that bureaucracy, the government had first appointed William Hastie, who was later the first African American federal judge, and William Hastie was really uncomfortable with being in a position where you recruited African American soldiers for the war effort and placed them in a situation that was no different from what they were used to in the worst of Jim Crow in the United States South. And he eventually resigned over the slowness of what he thought were efforts to provide a satisfactory role for African American soldiers in World War II. And he was replaced by a Chicagoan named Truman Gibson Jr. And Truman Gibson Jr., who was less vocal perhaps than Hastie, nevertheless was very closely allied to John Sengstack and to a number of the black newspaper publishers. And so they were willing to give qualified support to the war effort as long as they saw there were advances that led, for example, to the Tuskegee Airmen and their role in World War II, advances that led to the opening up of positions for African Americans in the United States Navy, which had previously been limited really to cooks and custodial positions. So this was, we can see an inside story that we could not see perhaps before. That's one story that I think is fascinating. There are many one could tell, but here's another one. I want you to think about a family, your family, anybody's family. Do you still keep in touch with someone with whom your closest common ancestor dates from 1847? Of course not. Nobody does. Virtually nobody does. But the Sengstack family started in a marriage between a German sea captain who settled in Savannah, Georgia, and an African-American former slave whose parents had come from West Africa, Igbo, from West Africa, married in 1849, and the descendants of that family, both in the United States and in Germany, maintain connections to this day. That is, Robert Abbott, the founder of the Defender, John Sengstack, his nephew, Bobby Sengstack, the person who donated this collection, kept, and many other members of the family, kept in regular touch with their German cousins throughout this whole period, except during the years of Hitler, but actually almost right up into them in 1930. Members of the Sengstack family, including his sister and cousin, visited their relatives in Germany. Bobby Sengstack, who is a photographer and filmmaker of international acclaim, went to the Berlin Film Festival to present his new film, and on the way stopped in Bremen, Germany, and had a week-long family reunion with all the family. And this is very strange stuff. And you have to think about what it might mean that a family would have that sense of family history, of a consciousness that spans continents, spans races, and has a sense of achievement that this family was responsible for. So those are two stories. Well, I think that one of the things we're very concerned about in the Harsh collection is accessibility of primary sources in African American studies. We are in touch all the time with our sister repositories in New York, in Washington, in New Orleans, in Nashville, that are the main repositories for African American primary sources. And so much has been lost over the years that we are constantly fighting a battle to be sure that things that are absolutely crucial do not go the way of the fire or the garbage can or just the neglect of time. This is a wonderful success story in saving the papers of a tremendously important African American family and making them available, accessible to researchers, not only academic researchers, and we certainly love academic researchers, but to community researchers as well. This collection is a collection that started out of the tradition of Carter G. Woodson. Vivian Harsh, who founded the collection, was an activist in Carter Woodson's Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. So this is a collection that is visited by and used by people of all walks of life. And this collection, this particular collection, the Abbott Sengstack family papers, speaks to so many different interests in African American studies. It's just a wonderful collection, and this could not have been achieved without the participation of Jacqueline Goldsby's Mapping the Stacks projects and of the interns that you have here today. And they have just been magnificent in getting this process.